Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into a cabin so far from anywhere that the nearest neighbour is a half-day's walk through snow that doesn't remember what bare ground looks like. This is Bedtime Survivalist, and tonight we're going back to the 1700s into a small wooden home somewhere in the deep cold of the northern wilderness, where a family's about to spend another night at 20 degrees below zero with nothing between them and the dark but timber, clay, wool, and fire. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually find something here worth coming back for. And a genuine thank you to everyone who's been leaving topic suggestions in the comments. I read every one of them, and tonight's story came from one of you. Let me know down below where you're listening from and what the temperature is on your end right now, since it's always strangely comforting to hear how far this reaches. We're also on Spotify now if you'd rather just listen with the lights off, and if you want more of this to fall asleep to, the channel membership gives you hours of ad-free video whenever you need it. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, get under the blankets, maybe pull them up just a little higher than usual, and let's begin. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to stay alive through a single winter night before anyone had ever heard of central heating, insulated windows, or a thermostat you could simply turn up? Could you have kept a fire burning through 8 hours of darkness without once letting it die? Would you have known how to seal a wall against wind using nothing but clay and animal hair? Could you have trusted your own preparation, made months earlier in the warmth of autumn, to actually hold when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze water inside your own house? Tonight, you're going to find out, because tonight, you are not you. You are a settler in a remote wooden cabin sometime in the 1700s, and outside your walls, the temperature has fallen to 20 below. The wind is moving through the trees with a sound like something breathing, and inside, your family is beginning the long, quiet, practiced work of getting through the night alive. Nobody is coming to check on you. Nobody's coming to save you if something goes wrong. Whatever happens between now and sunrise is entirely, completely up to what you built, what you stored, and what you know. Let's step inside. The sun goes down early out here, and it goes down for good. By mid-afternoon, the light has already turned thin and blue, sliding sideways through bare branches, and by the time it's fully gone, the temperature that felt merely uncomfortable an hour ago has become something else entirely, something with teeth. You've felt this shift enough times now to know exactly what it means. It means the real cold is arriving. The kind that doesn't ease off overnight, the kind that settles in and stays until well past midnight, sometimes not loosening its grip until close to dawn. You live here, on a small clearing you and your family carved out of the forest yourselves, miles from the nearest town, further still from the nearest doctor, connected to the rest of the world by a single narrow trail that will be buried under snow by morning. There is no help coming tonight. There has never been help coming. Not really, not out here. What you have is what you built, what you grew, what you cut, dried and stacked with your own hands over the long months when the cold was still just a rumor on the horizon. Tonight, all of that preparation is about to be tested, the way it is tested essentially every night from November through March, because out here, survival isn't a single dramatic event. It is not a storm you weather once and then forget. It is 1,000 small, quiet, repeated acts of discipline performed again and again, night after night, for months on end, until repetition itself becomes the thing that keeps you alive. Picture the cabin as it stands right now, in this exact moment, holding its ground against a wilderness that has no particular interest in whether you make it to morning. It is a single, low structure of thick, horizontal logs, small by any modern measure, with a roof pitched steep enough to shed snow before its weight becomes dangerous, and walls thick enough that you can lean against them and feel almost nothing of what's happening on the other side. There is one door, heavy, close-fitted, facing away from the prevailing wind, because you learned the hard way in your very first winter here that a door facing the wrong direction turns your home into a chimney, working against you instead of for you. There are perhaps 2 small windows, if you're fortunate enough to have real glass at all, more likely covered in oiled paper or simply shuttered tight and left dark until spring. This is not a house built for light or view. It is built for one purpose only: to hold heat in and cold out, and every design choice inside it, every log, every seam, every angle of the roof exists in service of that single, unglamorous goal. You didn't understand any of this when you first arrived. Nobody does. The families who built these cabins learned through cold nights that taught hard lessons, through winters that punished every mistake in the design, every gap left unsealed, every corner cut in the rush to have shelter before the first real freeze. What stands now is the product of trial, of failure, of adjustment, refined winter after winter, until the structure itself has become something close to a living memory of every hard lesson learned. The logs are thick, cut from trees felled specifically for this purpose, notched and stacked with a precision that looks almost effortless, but represents weeks of careful, exhausting labor. Between each log, in every seam where wood meets wood, there is a packed mixture of clay, moss, and often animal hair, worked into every gap by hand, sometimes redone every autumn as the logs shift and settle and new cracks appear. This process, this sealing of every possible gap, is not a minor chore. It is arguably the single most important task of your entire year, because a wall with even a narrow, unsealed seam is a wall that will let the cold in relentlessly, hour after hour, undoing every bit of warmth your fire manages to produce. You think about this often on nights like tonight, when the wind is audible even through the walls, a low, steady pressure against the timber that never quite stops. You think about the difference between a home properly sealed and one that isn't, because you've felt both. Your first winter here, before you understood how much the small gaps mattered, you spent nights lying awake, listening to a thin, high whistle of air finding its way through a seam near the door, feeling a stream of cold settle across the floor, like water finding the lowest point in a room. You know now that a single unfilled crack, no wider than a finger, can undo hours of careful fire tending. So every autumn, before the first hard frost, you and whoever else is in this house spend days going log by log, seam by seam, checking, repacking, filling anything that has opened since last year. It is slow, unglamorous, forgettable work, the kind that produces nothing you can point to with pride, no dramatic accomplishment, just a wall that is quietly, invisibly, doing its job a little better than it did last year. And that, more than almost anything else, is the truth at the center of surviving a winter like this one. The dramatic moments are rare, the unglamorous ones are constant, and they are the ones that actually matter. Inside, the cabin is arranged with an economy that would look almost bare to modern eyes, but every inch of it reflects a decision made for warmth rather than comfort in any decorative sense. The ceiling is low, deliberately so, because a lower ceiling means less air to heat, less volume for warmth to rise into and waste itself against a distant roof. If there's a loft, it sits close above the main room, warmed by the same rising heat that fills the space below, and it is very often where the children sleep, tucked close to the ceiling, where the warm air naturally gathers. The floor beneath you might be packed earth, or rough planks laid directly over it, occasionally covered with hides or woven mats. Anything that stands between bare skin and the cold that radiates up relentlessly from the ground itself. Along one wall, sometimes banked up on the outside as well, earth has been piled deliberately against the timber, an extra layer of insulation that costs nothing but labour and makes a real, measurable difference on the very coldest nights. Every choice you see here, the low ceiling, the small windows, the tight, single room, the banked earth, exists because someone at some point learned through a hard winter exactly what happens when you don't make that choice. At the centre of it all sits the hearth, and it is impossible to overstate what that fire means to everyone in this house tonight. It is not simply a source of warmth. It is the entire organising principle of your evening, your winter, your survival. Everything else, the walls, the ceiling, the layout, exists to protect and preserve what that fire produces. Right now, in the early evening, it's burning high and bright, throwing warm orange light across the room, and your family is gathered close around it, finishing the day's last tasks before the long settling into night begins. But a fire like this doesn't simply keep itself going. It requires constant, careful attention, an entire rhythm of feeding and banking and watching that will carry on in one form or another until the sun comes up again. And that rhythm, the true nightly heartbeat of this cabin, is where we're headed next. The woodpile stacked along the outer wall didn't appear by accident, and it certainly wasn't gathered in the days just before winter arrived. It represents months of labour stretching back to late summer, when the days were still long and warm, and the last thing on anyone's mind, at least emotionally, was the bitter cold now pressing against these walls. You know better than to wait. Everyone out here learns, usually within their first year, that firewood cut in autumn and burned immediately is nowhere near as effective as wood that has had proper time to season, to dry out slowly until its moisture content drops low enough to burn hot, clean, and long instead of smouldering, hissing, and filling the cabin with smoke. So the cutting begins early, often as soon as the last of the planting is finished, and it continues steadily through the summer and early fall, log after log, split and stacked in careful rows, designed to let air move freely between them. By the time the first true frost arrives, you need enough wood not for a week, not for a month, but for the entire winter, calculated with real care, because running short in February, when the roads are impassable and the cold is at its worst, is not a mistake you get a chance to correct. Inside the cabin itself, near the hearth, there is always a smaller supply kept close, wood brought in from outside and left to dry further in the warmth of the main room, ready to be fed into the fire without the delay of trudging out into the dark and cold to fetch more at 2 in the morning. This detail matters more than it might seem. On the coldest nights, someone in this house will wake, likely more than once, specifically to tend that fire, and the last thing anyone wants in that half-asleep, half-frozen moment is to have to go outside first. So, the wood sits ready close at hand, a small, quiet convenience built entirely out of hard experience. As the evening deepens and the family finishes the last of the day's work, checking that the animals are secured, that water isn't yet frozen solid, that every door and shutter is closed tight, the fire begins its slow transformation from the bright, active blaze of daytime cooking into something built specifically to last through the night. This is the art of banking a fire, and it's a skill every person in this house has learned, because it is quite possibly the single most important task standing between this family and a genuinely dangerous drop in temperature by morning. Banking means burying the glowing coals beneath a careful layer of ash, thick enough to slow the burn dramatically without smothering it completely, creating embers that will smoulder quietly for hours, holding just enough heat to be coaxed back into flame with fresh wood, and a little patience come the deepest, coldest part of the night. Get the ash layer wrong, too thin, and the fire burns through its fuel too fast, leaving cold coals and a freezing house well before dawn. Get it wrong the other way, too thick, and the fire can smother entirely, leaving you to rebuild from nothing in the dark, in the cold, with fingers that are already starting to go numb. You've watched this ritual performed so many times now that you could likely do it half asleep, which, on more than one occasion, you actually have. Someone kneels close to the hearth in the flickering last light of the evening flame, working the coals into a compact bed at the center, then carefully drawing the surrounding ash over them, patting it down, checking the shape, listening in a strange, almost intuitive way, for whether it feels right. It's not a science written down anywhere. It's knowledge passed from one winter to the next, refined through trial, through the occasional cold, miserable morning that taught a lesson nobody wanted to learn twice. And then, inevitably, someone in this house will wake in the deep hours of the night, not from any noise, not from any crisis, but simply from a kind of internal clock built over years of doing exactly this. They'll rise quietly from beneath heavy blankets into air that has noticeably cooled, cross the dark room to the hearth, and carefully uncover the banked coals, feeding in fresh wood, coaxing the fire back toward life before the room has a chance to grow properly cold. This isn't dramatic. Nobody speaks of it as heroic. It's simply what gets done, an unspoken shift, a duty that rotates between whoever in the household is capable of it, night after night, all winter long, until it becomes as automatic and unremarkable as breathing. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most important jobs in this entire household, and almost nobody outside these walls will ever know it happened at all. There's a particular sound this cabin makes on nights like tonight, a low creak of settling timber as the cold outside contracts the wood, a faint hiss and pop from the hearth, the soft rustle of someone shifting beneath heavy blankets. If you listen closely enough, past the wind pressing steadily against the walls, you can almost hear the whole structure working, quietly, patiently, holding its warmth against everything the night is trying to take away. And that work, that quiet, constant, unglamorous labour of keeping a fire fed and a family warm through the deep hours of a sub-zero night is only the beginning of what it took to survive out here. Because staying warm wasn't only about the fire in front of you, it was also about what you were wearing, what you were lying on, and how close you were willing to sleep beside the people you loved. And that's where we're headed next. Even with the fire carefully banked and glowing steady in its bed of ash, no household out here relied on a single hearth to carry an entire family safely through 8 or more hours of sub-zero darkness. The fire was the foundation, but the true final layer of defense against the cold was much closer, wrapped directly around everybody in this house. Tonight, as every other night, getting ready for bed doesn't mean changing into something lighter and more comfortable the way it might for you back in your own world. It often means the opposite entirely. On the coldest nights, many people out here sleep in much of what they wore during the day, sometimes adding layers rather than removing them. Because the difference between a comfortable night and a genuinely dangerous one can come down to nothing more complicated than how much wool is between your skin and the air. Wool is, without exaggeration, one of the most valuable materials in this entire household, more valuable in its own way than almost anything else you own. It holds warmth even when damp, which matters enormously in a house where a little condensation gathering near the walls on the coldest nights is simply an accepted fact of life. Heavy wool stockings, wool undergarments, wool coverings layered one over another, all of it exists for one purpose, trapping thin pockets of warm air against the body, air that your own skin has already worked to heat, air that a single thin layer simply cannot hold on to. You've learned, through experience rather than instruction, exactly how many layers tonight's temperature demands, an intuition built the same slow way as every other skill in this house, through winters that taught you precisely what happens when you underestimate the cold. The bed itself is not the soft, cushioned surface you might imagine from a warmer, gentler world. The mattress beneath you is very likely a simple ticking, a coarse fabric casing stuffed full of straw or dried corn husks, replaced or refreshed each autumn before the cold sets in properly. It's not especially comfortable by any modern standard, but it serves its actual purpose well, providing a layer of insulation between sleeping bodies and the floor below, which, however carefully built, is always noticeably colder than the air just above it. Over this go heavy quilts, sometimes several layers deep, often supplemented with actual animal hides, thick and heavy enough to trap warmth, even as the room around you continues to cool through the long hours of the night. And then there's the particular, almost universal trick that nearly every household out here relies on, one you've come to genuinely look forward to on the coldest evenings. Before anyone actually climbs into bed, a stone or sometimes a brick is heated carefully near the hearth, wrapped tightly in cloth and tucked down into the bedding itself, right at the foot of the bed where feet will land first. There's something almost startlingly comforting about sliding your feet against that small, contained warmth on a night when the rest of the room feels like it's actively working against you. It won't stay warm forever, an hour or two at most before it settles down to match the temperature around it, but that hour or two matters enormously, easing the shock of climbing into what would otherwise be genuinely cold bedding giving your body a head start on generating and holding its own warmth for the rest of the night. But perhaps the single most effective strategy of all, more reliable than any quilt or heated stone, is one that has nothing to do with fabric or fire at all. It's simply proximity. Bodies sleeping close together share warmth in a way that no blanket alone can replicate. And in a household like this one, that isn't treated as an afterthought, it's a deliberate, practical arrangement. Children often sleep pressed close to parents or to each other, not merely for comfort or affection, though certainly for that too, but because shared body heat, contained beneath heavy blankets in a small enclosed space, genuinely makes a measurable difference in how warm everyone stays through the night. On the very coldest nights, the entire household might end up gathered closer together than usual. Everyone shifted, nearer the hearth, blankets pooled and shared, the strict boundaries of individual beds dissolving a little in favour of simple, practical survival. There's an intimacy to this that's easy to overlook from a distance, but living it, night after night, through months of genuine cold, it becomes one of the quiet truths of this entire way of life. Out here, warmth isn't only something you build with logs and clay and careful fires, it's something you generate together, deliberately, by choosing to stay close. And all of this, the layered wool, the straw mattress, the heated stone, the shared warmth of bodies close together, exists within a larger rhythm, a nightly routine this family follows with the same quiet discipline as everything else we've talked about tonight. That routine: who tends the fire and when, who checks on the animals before the doors are sealed, how the youngest and the oldest are positioned closest to the warmth, is its own careful choreography, refined over years until it runs almost without anyone needing to think about it consciously at all. And that's exactly where we pick up now, as the evening in this small cabin continues to unfold. Every household out here runs on a rhythm so familiar it barely needs discussing anymore, but it wasn't always this smooth. In your first winter, the evening felt chaotic, everyone reaching for the same tasks at once, nobody quite sure who should be doing what, precious time wasted while the temperature outside kept dropping. Now, years in, the division of labour has settled into something closer to muscle memory. A quiet choreography performed the same way night after night, with barely a word exchanged. Someone tends the fire, always. Someone checks the animals one final time, making sure the small lean-to attached to the cabin, or the modest barn a short distance away, is sealed as tightly as your own front door. Someone gathers the youngest children, herding them through the last of their evening tasks, washing, dressing for bed, settling arguments over whose turn it is to sleep closest to the warm side of the loft. It looks, from the outside, almost effortless. It is not effortless. It is the product of years of trial, the same slow refinement that shaped the cabin's walls, now shaping the family's habits until the whole evening runs like a single, well-oiled mechanism built entirely out of repetition. Where everyone sleeps is not left to chance either. There is a clear, unspoken logic to it, one shaped by cold, hard experience rather than convenience or fairness. The youngest children sleep closest to the hearth or nearest the warm air pooling in the loft, because their smaller bodies lose heat faster than an adult's and have far less capacity to fight off a genuinely cold night. The oldest members of the household, if there are grandparents or elderly relatives living here, are positioned with similar care, tucked into whichever corner holds warmth longest, watched over just a little more closely than everyone else because you've learned, sometimes through loss, that age and cold are a dangerous combination nobody out here takes lightly. The strongest, healthiest adults, the ones best equipped to withstand a colder corner of the room or a night interrupted by fire-tending duty, take the positions everyone else would rather avoid, nearest the door, nearest the draftiest wall, willingly, because that's simply how a household like this survives. Nobody assigns these positions formally. They emerged the way most things out here emerge, through necessity, through one hard winter that taught you exactly where the cold gathers and exactly who needs protecting from it most. The animals complicate the evening in their own way, and they matter more to your family's survival than most people from a warmer, gentler world would ever guess. Out here, livestock isn't simply property. It's food stored on the hoof, wool waiting to be sheared, labour for the fields once spring finally returns, and on the coldest nights, sometimes, warmth itself. Many households build a small lean-to directly against one wall of the cabin, close enough that the body heat of a cow, a few goats, or a handful of chickens actually radiates faintly into the main living space, a rough but genuinely useful supplement to the fire burning inside. In the very worst cold snaps, some families bring the smaller animals directly indoors for the night, chickens tucked into a corner near the hearth, goats crowded into whatever space can be spared, an arrangement that would seem strange or even unpleasant to modern sensibilities, but that made complete practical sense to people whose entire winter survival depended on keeping every living thing on the property, human and animal alike, from freezing. You remember the winter you lost 2 hens to a cold snap that caught you unprepared, how the loss meant fewer eggs through the following months, how you never made that particular mistake again. Every animal here represents calculated risk and hard-won lessons, just like everything else. Before the final settling into night, there's almost always a quiet stretch of time by the fire, the day's work finished, the animals secured, the youngest children beginning to grow drowsy against whoever is holding them close. This is when the household slows down together, when someone might tell a story, recount something from the day, or simply sit in comfortable, exhausted silence while the fire pops and settles in the hearth. In many homes, this quiet hour carries a thread of faith running through it, a prayer said together, a hymn hummed low, words repeated so often across so many winters that they have become less a formal ritual and more a kind of comfort, a way of marking the transition from the labour of the day into the vulnerability of the night ahead. It's a small moment easy to overlook when you're cataloguing woodpiles and wall seams and heated stones, but it matters enormously to the people living through it. A brief pause of genuine connection before everyone retreats into the private, individual work of simply staying warm until morning. There's something worth sitting with here, something about how survival out here was never purely a mechanical problem solved by sufficient wool and a well-banked fire. It was also, always, a social one, a problem solved through the careful, deliberate arrangement of people around each other, through shared responsibility, through the simple decision to keep the youngest and oldest closest to the warmth, even when it meant someone stronger took the harder position by the door. Out here, in a cabin this small, this isolated, survival and closeness were never separate ideas. They were, in the most literal sense possible, the exact same thing. By the time the fire has been banked for the night, the animals settled, the children finally drifting into the heavy, particular sleep that only real physical exhaustion produces, the cabin has entered its longest and quietest stretch, the deep hours between the last waking task of the evening and whoever wakes first to tend the fire again. This is when the household is most vulnerable, and it's also when we need to talk honestly about what could go wrong, because surviving a night like this one wasn't only about staying warm. It was also about staying safe from a handful of quiet, easily overlooked dangers that this same fire, this same sealed cabin, could just as easily create. It's a strange, uncomfortable truth that the very fire keeping you alive tonight is also, in its own quiet way, one of the greatest risks inside these walls. You've thought about this more than once, lying awake in the dark, listening to the low pop and settle of the coals across the room. A chimney that hasn't been properly maintained can build up creosote along its inner walls, a dark, tar-like residue left behind by burning wood, and if that build-up catches, the result is a chimney fire, fast, violent, and terrifying in a house built almost entirely of timber. You know families, or have heard of families, who lost everything to exactly this: a spark catching in a neglected flue in the middle of the night, flames racing upward faster than anyone could respond. So the chimney gets checked regularly, deliberately, not because it's an enjoyable task, but because the alternative is unthinkable. You clean it, you watch it, you know its particular sounds and quirks the way you know the creak of your own floorboards, because out here, familiarity with your own home is not a luxury, it's a form of insurance nobody else is going to provide. There's a second danger, quieter and less dramatic than fire, but in some ways more insidious, and that's the question of air itself. A cabin sealed as tightly as yours, every seam packed with clay and moss, specifically to keep warmth in, creates a genuine tension between staying warm and staying properly ventilated. Burn a fire in a space that's too tightly closed, without enough fresh air moving through, and you risk a slow build-up of smoke and fumes that can leave a household groggy, headachy, disoriented, in the worst cases far more seriously harmed than that. You've learned, the way you've learned everything else out here through careful observation and the occasional uncomfortable morning, exactly how to balance this. A small gap left deliberately near the chimney, a shutter cracked just slightly on the calmest nights, enough movement of air to keep the room breathable without undoing all the careful sealing that keeps the cold at bay. It's a narrow line to walk, warmth on one side, safety on the other, and walking it correctly, night after night, is simply one more quiet skill this life has demanded of you. Then there's the cold itself, in its more insidious forms, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a roaring fire or a collapsing chimney, but simply creeps in, patient and thorough, wherever your attention lapses. On the coldest nights, you've woken to find a thin skin of ice formed on the water barrel just inside the door, the coldest corner of the cabin, having dropped low enough, despite the fire, despite the sealed walls, to freeze standing water only a few feet from where your family sleeps. You've seen frost form on the inside of a window on a particularly brutal night, delicate and strange, a small, quiet reminder of exactly how thin the margin is between the warmth you've built and the cold pressing endlessly against it. These aren't emergencies exactly, not on their own, but they're warnings. Small signals that the cold is finding its way in somewhere, and a family that ignores enough small warnings eventually finds itself facing a large one. Illness is perhaps the danger you fear most, more than fire, more than frost. Because illness in a house this isolated carries a weight that's hard to fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. A close, sealed cabin, a family sleeping pressed together night after night for warmth, is also, unfortunately, an efficient way for sickness to move from one person to another. A cough that starts with one child can, within days, work its way through the entire household, and there is no doctor to call, no medicine beyond what you've gathered and dried yourself, no help beyond what your own hands and your own knowledge can provide. You keep a small store of herbs, remedies passed down and refined through experience, and you watch closely, anxiously, whenever anyone in this house shows the first signs of feeling unwell, because out here, a simple illness that would be a minor inconvenience elsewhere can become something far more serious, far more quickly than it ever would in a place with help nearby. This is, in the end, the deepest truth beneath every danger we've discussed tonight: the fire, the sealed walls, the frost, the illness. It's the isolation itself, the simple, unavoidable fact that whatever happens in this cabin, good or bad, happens without outside help. There is no one to call, no neighbor close enough to hear you if something goes wrong in the middle of the night, no road passable enough in the depth of winter to bring a doctor or even a friendly face until the thaw finally arrives. Every precaution you take, every seam sealed, every fire banked correctly, every layer of wool, every heated stone, exists because you understand completely and without illusion that you are entirely on your own out here, and somehow, remarkably, night after night, that understanding doesn't paralyze you, it sharpens you. It's exactly what makes you as careful, as thorough, as quietly disciplined as you've become. Even with all of this weighing on you, the fire crackling low, the cold pressing steadily at the walls, there's still the simple, practical matter of keeping your bodies fed through a season when the ground itself has gone hard and unyielding, and that's a challenge every bit as demanding, in its own way, as keeping the cabin warm, because staying warm through a night like this one takes more than wool and fire. It takes fuel, real fuel, food stored carefully enough to last an entire winter without ever running short, and that's exactly where we're headed next. The root cellar dug into the earth a short distance from the cabin door is, in its own understated way, every bit as important to your family's survival as the hearth burning steadily inside. It doesn't look like much, a low mound of packed earth, a simple door set into the hillside. But what it holds inside determines whether this household eats well or eats poorly for the next 5 or 6 months, because out here, once the ground freezes solid, there is no more growing, no more gathering, nothing coming from the earth again until spring finally breaks the frost. Everything you'll eat between now and then is already here, already stored, the product of an entire summer and autumn of careful, relentless labor. Root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, packed carefully in sand or straw to keep them from rotting or freezing solid, line the shelves in careful rows. Barrels of salted meat, preserved through methods perfected over generations, sit stacked against the coolest wall. Strings of dried apples, sacks of grain, jars of preserves made from whatever fruit the summer offered, all of it calculated, counted, rationed, with a precision that has nothing to do with stinginess and everything to do with simple arithmetic. Enough food, divided across enough days, to reach the other side of winter without anyone going hungry. You think, sometimes, about how different this is from simply deciding what to eat each day. Out here, that decision was made months ago, in the heat of late summer, when you and your family stood in the garden calculating exactly how much needed to be preserved, how much salted, how much dried, based on careful estimates of how many mouths there'd be to feed and how long the cold season might stretch this particular year. Guess wrong. Store too little, and February becomes a genuine crisis rather than simply an uncomfortable stretch of scarcity. You've heard of families who miscalculated, who ran short before the thaw, who spent the final weeks of winter rationing meals down to almost nothing, waiting anxiously for the first signs of spring. It's not a mistake you intend to repeat, and so every autumn the counting and storing happens with a seriousness that borders on ritual, because out here, arithmetic done wrong in September becomes hunger felt in March. Eating well before bed matters more out here than it might seem. And it's not simply about comfort or habit. Your body generates its own warmth through the night by burning fuel, quite literally. And a body that goes to sleep with an empty stomach has noticeably less to work with. When the temperature outside drops toward its lowest point in the deep hours before dawn. You've learned to make sure the evening meal, however simple, however repetitive it might become across a long winter, is substantial enough to carry everyone through the night. A hearty stew simmered over the hearth for hours, thick with preserved meat and root vegetables, enough to leave a genuine, lasting warmth in the stomach that lingers well past the meal itself. It's a small piece of practical wisdom, but it's one that matters enormously when the difference between a comfortable night and a genuinely cold, restless one can come down to something as simple as what and how much everyone ate a few hours earlier. Water presents its own quiet, persistent challenge, one that never quite goes away for the entire length of the cold season. The stream or spring you rely on through the warmer months freezes over, sometimes solid enough that reaching water beneath the ice becomes a genuine daily task, chopping through a layer that reforms almost as quickly as it's broken. Barrels kept just inside the cabin door freeze too, on the coldest nights, a thin skin forming across the surface by morning, even with the fire burning steadily just a few feet away. This is simply accepted as part of the rhythm of winter life, one more task added to the long list of small, unglamorous chores that keep this household functioning. Chopping ice, melting snow when necessary, hauling water carefully back to the cabin before it has a chance to freeze again on the short walk home. There's a particular kind of resourcefulness that develops out here, born entirely of necessity, a way of looking at every single resource, food, water, wood, wool, and seeing not just what it is, but exactly how far it needs to stretch and for how long. Nothing is wasted, not because waste is considered morally wrong in some abstract sense, but because waste, out here, is simply dangerous. A dropped scrap of meat, a spoiled sack of grain, a barrel of water left carelessly to freeze and crack, these aren't minor inconveniences. They're small subtractions from a supply that has to last an exact, calculated span of months. and every subtraction narrows the margin a little further. You've become, without ever consciously deciding to, someone who notices resources the way other people might notice weather, constantly, instinctively, a background awareness that never fully switches off, even in the quietest, most peaceful moments of the evening. And so the household moves through its winter, not simply enduring the cold, but actively managing an entire interconnected system of fuel, food, and careful labour, each piece dependent on the others, each mistake in one area capable of creating real danger in another. A poorly stocked woodpile means a fire that can't be properly maintained. A poorly stocked root cellar means bodies that struggle to generate their own warmth. It's all connected, all part of the same quiet, demanding arithmetic of survival that governs every single day of this long season. And understanding that connection, feeling it in your bones the way you do now after so many winters, is perhaps the single most important form of knowledge this life has taught you. As the fire burns low and the household finally settles into the deepest, quietest hours of the night, there's a different kind of challenge that begins to surface, one that has nothing to do with wood or wool or stored food at all. It's the challenge of the mind of enduring not just a single cold night, but months of them, stretched out ahead of you in a long, dark, repetitive span that tests something deeper than physical endurance alone. And that's exactly where we're headed next. There's a particular weight to winter out here that has very little to do with temperature and everything to do with time, with the sheer, stretching length of the season and the narrow, dim hours of daylight that frame each day inside it. By this point in the year, the sun rises late and sets early, leaving only a handful of genuinely bright hours squeezed between two long stretches of darkness, and the effect of that, accumulated day after day, week after week, is something you've come to understand as its own particular kind of burden, separate from cold, separate from hunger, but just as real. You felt it settle over the household in different ways, a certain heaviness in the quiet hours, a restlessness in the children who have far less room to run and play than the warmer months allow, a stillness that can tip, if you're not careful, from peaceful into something closer to isolation, pressing in from every direction. Enduring this, you've learned, is its own discipline, every bit as deliberate and practiced as sealing a wall or banking a fire. The evenings, so long and dark, could easily become empty, hollow stretches of time if the household simply let them, but instead they've become something else entirely, filled deliberately with the small rituals that make the darkness bearable. Storytelling is one of the most reliable of these tales passed down through years, some old, some invented fresh in the moment, told by firelight while hands stay busy with mending or carving or spinning wool into thread. There's something about the combination, the flickering light, the low, familiar voice, the small, productive task occupying restless hands, that turns what could be an oppressive stretch of darkness into something closer to comfort, a routine the household actually looks forward to rather than simply endures. Handwork fills much of these long evening hours, and it isn't simply a way to pass time, though it certainly does that. Every stitch mended, every length of wool spun, every small tool repaired by firelight is another quiet contribution to the household's survival, proof in the smallest and most tangible way that the hours aren't being wasted even when nothing dramatic is happening. You've come to find a genuine, settled satisfaction in this kind of work. The repetitive motion of it, the way it occupies just enough of your attention to keep restless thoughts at bay without demanding so much focus that it becomes its own kind of stress. There's a rhythm to it that mirrors, in some ways, the rhythm of the whole winter itself. Small, steady, repeated actions that don't look like much in any single moment, but that add up over the full stretch of the season into something genuinely substantial. Faith plays its own quiet role in carrying this household through the darkest stretch of the year. And it's not something you think about often in any formal sense, but it's there, woven through the small rituals of the evening, the prayer said before sleep, the quiet trust that this same discipline, this same careful preparation has carried you and your family safely through every winter before this one. There's a particular comfort in that continuity, in knowing that the woodpiles stacked outside, the root cellar packed full, the walls sealed tight against the wind, represent not just this year's labour, but years of accumulated knowledge, refined and passed down, tested against real cold and real hunger, and proven winter after winter to actually work. You trust it because you've watched it work before, because you've made it through nights every bit as cold as tonight and woken to find the fire still glowing, the family still warm, the cabin still standing exactly as it should. And yet, even with all of that trust, even with all of that accumulated experience, there are moments, quiet and private, when the isolation presses in a little harder than usual, when the sheer distance between this cabin and the rest of the world feels less like independence and more like genuine vulnerability. You've had nights like that, lying awake listening to the wind, thinking about how far away help truly is, how entirely this family's fate rests on decisions made months ago and maintained carefully, night after night, ever since. It's not a comfortable thought, and you don't dwell on it long, but it's honest, and it's part of what makes the discipline of this life mean something. You're not fearless out here, you're simply prepared, and preparation, you've come to understand, is its own quiet answer to fear, not an elimination of it, but a way of meeting it with something solid to stand on. The children handle the long darkness differently than you do, and watching them has taught you something about resilience you might not have learned otherwise. They don't carry the same weight of responsibility, the same constant background awareness of resources and risk that occupies your mind through most of the winter, and so the long evenings become, for them, simply time, filled with whatever games can be invented in a small space, whatever stories capture their attention, whatever small chores they've been given that make them feel useful and included. There's something almost restorative in watching that, in seeing the darkness held at bay not through grim endurance, but through something closer to genuine contentment, proof that this life, hard as it is, hasn't hollowed out everything soft and warm from the people living it. As the night deepens further and the household finally quiets into sleep, one by one the fire tended, the stories finished, the last of the evening's small tasks completed. There's a particular stillness that settles over the cabin, the specific, hard-won stillness of a family that has done everything within its power to make it safely through to morning. Whether morning arrives easily or brings its own new challenges is something we'll find out together, because the deepest, coldest hours of this particular night are still ahead of us, and there's still a great deal more to discover about exactly what it took, night after night, season after season, for a family like yours to survive out here. There's a particular hour, somewhere well past midnight and still some distance from dawn, that everyone out here comes to know intimately, whether they choose to or not. It's the coldest point of the night, the hour when whatever heat the day managed to store in the earth and the air has finally been spent, when the fire has burned down furthest from its evening height, when the wind, if it's going to rise, tends to rise hardest. You've learned to recognize this hour almost without needing to check anything, a particular quality to the cold that reaches you even through blankets and wool, and the lingering warmth of bodies sleeping close together, a stillness in the cabin that feels different from the stillness of early evening. This is the hour the fire tender wakes for, the hour the banked coals are checked most carefully, because if the fire is going to fail anywhere in the night, this is where it happens, at the furthest point, from both the warmth of evening and the promise of morning. You know this hour the way you know the sound of your own front door, and over the years you've stopped resenting the interruption to your sleep and started in a strange way almost trusting it. There's something steadying about waking in the dead of night, crossing the dark room to the hearth and finding the coals exactly where they should be, glowing faintly beneath their blanket of ash, patient and waiting. It's a small, private confirmation repeated night after night that the systems you've built are holding, that the walls are doing their work, that the woodpile stacked outside is still sufficient, that everyone under this roof is still safe. You add wood carefully, watch the flame catch and steady, and stand there a moment longer than strictly necessary, feeling the fresh heat begin to press back against the cold that's crept into the room during the fire's quietest hours. Then you return to bed, sliding back beneath the blankets, back into the warmth left by the people sleeping beside you, and you sleep again, usually without difficulty, because exhaustion out here is honest and deep and doesn't leave much room for restlessness. On the very coldest nights, though, this hour asks more of you than a simple check of the coals. You've had nights when you've woken not from habit but from an unmistakable chill in the air, sharper and more insistent than usual, and you've known immediately, without needing to think it through, that something has shifted, that the temperature outside has dropped further than expected, that tonight the fire needs more than its usual attention. On nights like that, you don't simply feed the fire and return to bed. You sit with it a while, feeding it more generously than usual, watching the flames climb higher, feeling for the exact moment the room's temperature begins to noticeably recover. You might check the water barrel by the door, find its skin of ice thicker than usual, and make a mental note to break through it again before anyone tries to use it in the morning. You might glance toward the loft where the children sleep, listening for the particular sound of comfortable, undisturbed breathing, rather than the restless shifting that signals real cold reaching them. These checks take only minutes, but they're the minutes that matter most in the entire 24-hour cycle of this household's winter life. The quiet, unglamorous vigilance that stands between an uneventful night and a genuinely dangerous one. There's a solitude to this hour that you've come to value in a way you didn't expect when you first arrived out here, years ago now. Everyone else is asleep. The cabin is dark except for the low orange glow of the hearth, and for a few minutes you're entirely alone with your own thoughts, the only person awake for what might be miles in every direction. It's not a lonely feeling, not exactly, though it could easily become one if you let it. Instead, there's something almost meditative about it, a rare pocket of true quiet in a life that's otherwise filled every waking hour with tasks and responsibilities and the constant low hum of managing a household survival. You've come, over the years, to almost look forward to this hour, this brief, solitary watch over the people you love, the fire, the walls, the whole fragile, carefully constructed system that's keeping everyone alive through the worst of the season. The wind tends to peak somewhere in these deepest hours as well, and on the harder nights, you can feel the cabin responding to it, a faint shudder in the timber, a slightly louder press of air against the walls, the specific sound of snow being driven hard against the shuttered windows. You've learned not to be alarmed by this, not anymore, though your very first winter out here, a night like this, genuinely frightened you. The sheer force of the wind making the whole structure feel smaller and more fragile than you wanted to believe. Now, you know the sounds. You know what the cabin can withstand. You know that the walls you sealed so carefully in autumn are doing exactly what they were built to do. But you still listen, out of habit as much as caution, tracking the wind's rise and fall the way a sailor might track the sea, aware that respect for these conditions, even after years of experience, is what keeps respect from curdling into complacency. Eventually, the wind eases or doesn't, and either way, the night continues its slow turn toward morning. The coldest hour passes, as it always does, and though you can't feel the shift happening in any dramatic way, you know from long experience that somewhere in these final hours before dawn, the very worst of the night's cold has already come and gone. What remains is simply the last stretch of darkness to get through, the household still sleeping, the fire still glowing steady. In its bed of ash, the whole quiet system still holding exactly as it should. And soon enough, that darkness will begin, almost imperceptibly at first, to lighten toward the grey-blue of early morning, and a new set of tasks, a new rhythm entirely, will begin to take shape. That's exactly where we're headed next. Morning arrives out here slowly, reluctantly, the sky lightening by degrees long before the sun itself actually clears the tree line, and there's a particular quality to that early grey light that you've come to associate more than almost anything else with quiet relief. Another night has passed. The fire held, the walls held. Everyone under this roof woke up. It's not a dramatic feeling, not something you describe as triumph in any grand sense, but it's real. A small, steady satisfaction that repeats itself morning after morning through the length of the winter. Each one a quiet confirmation that the preparation, the discipline, the endless small tasks of the previous months and the previous evening were, once again, enough. You're usually awake before the rest of the household, or very close to it, the same internal rhythm that wakes you in the coldest hour of the night, also nudging you awake as the darkness starts to thin toward dawn. The first task, always, is the fire, and by morning it's typically settled into little more than a bed of warm coals beneath the ash, enough heat remaining that reviving it takes only minutes rather than the careful, patient rebuilding a truly dead fire would require. You uncover the coals, add kindling, then heavier wood, and watch the flames climb back to life, the room slowly filling again with the particular orange light and gathering warmth that marks the real beginning of the day. There's a satisfaction in this small ritual that never quite fades. No matter how many mornings you've repeated it, the visible, tangible proof that the fire you tended so carefully through the night is still, this morning, exactly where it needs to be. The cold inside the cabin at this hour is at its sharpest. The accumulated chill of the whole long night settled into every corner, despite the fire's best efforts, and there's a particular briskness to these early minutes that wakes you far more effectively than any amount of daylight could. You move quickly, purposefully, through the first tasks of the day, building the fire back to its full strength, checking the water barrel for the thickness of its overnight ice, glancing toward the small high window to gauge the weather outside before anyone else has even stirred. This quiet stretch, just you and the reviving fire in the grey early light, has become one of the parts of your day you value most, a brief window of calm before the household wakes fully and the day's full list of tasks begins in earnest. One by one the rest of the family wakes, drawn from sleep by the growing warmth and light filling the room, the children first, usually still half tangled in blankets, reluctant to leave the warm nest they've built overnight. Then the adults, moving with the particular stiff efficiency of people accustomed to cold mornings. There's a brief flurry of activity, blankets folded or straightened, the heated stones from the night before retrieved and set aside to be reheated for the evening ahead, the straw ticking mattresses checked and, if needed, refreshed. Breakfast comes together quickly, something substantial and warming, often built around whatever was simmering in the pot the evening before, because out here, mornings don't allow for leisurely, elaborate cooking. There's too much day ahead, too many tasks waiting for anyone to linger long over the first meal. Checking on the animals is almost always among the very first tasks of the morning, and there's a particular held breath to it on the coldest mornings, a genuine unspoken concern until you've confirmed that everyone, human and animal alike, made it through the night intact. You remember mornings when that concern proved justified, when a hen or a young animal hadn't survived a particularly brutal cold snap. And the memory of those mornings sharpens your attention every single time you approach the lean-to or the small barn on a morning like this one. Most mornings, though, the news is good, the animals stirring, restless for feed and water, proof that the shelter you built for them held just as well as the shelter you built for yourselves. There's a moment, usually somewhere in these early morning tasks, when you step outside briefly, just for a few minutes, and take in the full scope of what the night actually looked like from outside these walls. The world beyond your cabin is transformed, every branch and rooftop and fence post carrying a thick, undisturbed layer of snow, the trail leading toward the distant road buried entirely, the whole landscape holding a kind of stillness that feels almost sacred in the early light. It's beautiful, genuinely, achingly beautiful in a way that never quite stops affecting you no matter how many winters you've spent out here. And it's also, in its own quiet way, a reminder of exactly how alone this small cabin is against a landscape this vast, this indifferent, this capable of swallowing a home whole if given the chance? You don't dwell on that thought long. There's too much to do, and the beauty of the morning, however sobering its context, is still genuinely worth pausing for. By the time the sun has properly cleared the trees, the household is fully in motion, the morning's most urgent tasks completed, the day's longer work just beginning to take shape. The fire burns steady in the hearth behind you as you step further out into the cold, and there's a whole day of labour ahead, different in character from the long, quiet vigilance of the night, but no less essential to the household's survival. And that daytime rhythm, so different from the hours we've spent together so far tonight, is exactly where we're headed next. Daylight out here is a resource every bit as carefully managed as firewood or stored food, and by this point in the winter, you've learned to treat every one of its brief hours with real deliberateness, because there simply isn't enough of it to waste. The sun that cleared the trees only an hour or two ago will already be sinking again well before what would count in a warmer season as the middle of the afternoon, and everything that needs doing outside the cabin, everything that requires real light and real warmth, however slight that warmth might be, has to happen within this narrow window. You've come to think of the day almost as a container, fixed and unyielding, and the skill of living well out here, you've realized, has as much to do with filling that container wisely as it does with anything else. The morning's chores stretch out from the cabin door in a familiar, well-worn sequence. Wood needs replenishing. Not just the small supply kept warm near the hearth, but the larger stacks outside, checked for any sign of dampness or disorder from the night's wind and snow. If there's a trapline set nearby, checking it is another early task. A walk out through snow that can be knee-deep or deeper, depending on the week, following a route you know so well by now that you could likely walk it with your eyes closed, though you never actually would, because out here, complacency about the landscape is its own quiet danger. Water needs hauling, ice needs breaking, and if the weather allows, there's the ongoing, never quite finished work of maintaining the cabin itself, patching a seam that's opened in the cold, checking the roof for any concerning build-up of snow, reinforcing whatever small weakness the previous night's cold might have revealed. There's a particular satisfaction in this daytime labour that's different from the quiet vigilance of the night, more active, more visibly productive, the kind of work that leaves you tired in a straightforward, honest way by the time the light starts fading again. You've come to genuinely value the contrast between the two halves of your day, the watchful stillness of the night hours and the purposeful motion of the day, each one balancing the other, each one asking something different of you and in its own way, giving something back. The cold outside during these daylight hours is real and constant, but it's a different kind of cold than the deep, still cold of night, one that moving bodies and steady labour can actually push back against in a way that's simply not possible while lying still beneath blankets in the dark. The children have their own daytime rhythm, smaller chores suited to their strength and age, fetching kindling, helping tend the animals, learning, gradually, the same skills that keep this household functioning, skills they'll need themselves one day if they choose a life like this one. You watch them sometimes, bundled heavily against the cold, moving through tasks that would have seemed impossibly hard to you at their age, and you feel a particular mix of pride and quiet worry that you suspect every parent out here carries through the winter months. Pride in how capable they're becoming. Worry about a world that demands this much capability from children this young. It's not a contradiction you've ever fully resolved, and you suspect you never will, but it's honest, and it sits alongside every other complicated feeling this life has taught you to hold at once. By early afternoon, the light has already begun its slow retreat, and there's a shift in the household's rhythm that you feel almost physically, an increasing urgency to finish whatever outdoor tasks remain before the temperature begins its serious evening drop. This is when the final wood is hauled in for the night, when the animals are checked once more and settled more securely against the coming dark, when any remaining outdoor work gets wrapped up with a briskness that wasn't necessary earlier in the day. You've learned to read this shift in the light the way you'd read a clock, an internal sense of exactly how much daylight remains and exactly how much needs to happen within it, refined over years until it operates almost entirely below conscious thought. There's something almost meditative about this whole daytime rhythm, despite how physically demanding it actually is, a kind of clarity that comes from work with such immediate, tangible stakes. Every task completed today is another small piece of insurance against tonight's cold, another log added to tonight's fire, another confirmation that tomorrow morning will look much like this one. The household intact, the systems holding, the long winter continuing its slow, steady progress towards spring. And as the light finally begins its serious fade toward evening once more, the household turns back toward the cabin, back toward the fire, back toward the same careful rhythm of preparation that we've spent tonight coming to understand so thoroughly. But not every night unfolds this steadily, and not every winter passes without a genuine test of everything this family has built. There are storms out here, real ones, the kind that push every single system to its actual limit, and it's exactly a night like that we're headed toward next. There are nights, thankfully rare, but never entirely absent from a winter out here, when the weather stops being simply cold and becomes something closer to an active adversary, and you can usually feel one of these nights coming hours before it actually arrives. The light fades strangely, a particular flat greyness settling over the sky well before the normal hour, and the air itself seems to carry a different kind of pressure, a stillness that feels less like calm and more like something gathering its strength. You've learned to trust this feeling completely, because it's never once been wrong. And on afternoons like this one, every single task shifts immediately into a different gear, faster, more urgent, driven by a clear understanding that whatever preparation isn't finished before the storm actually arrives may simply not get finished at all. The wood supply gets checked and rechecked with particular care on a day like this. Extra loads hauled in and stacked close to the hearth, well beyond what a normal night would require, because a storm out here can mean days rather than hours of being genuinely unable to safely step outside. The animals are secured as thoroughly as possible, every gap in their shelter checked and reinforced, extra feed and water set within easy reach in case tending them properly becomes difficult once the storm actually hits. Every seam in the cabin's walls gets a final inspection, every shutter is checked and secured, and the whole household moves through these preparations with a focused, wordless efficiency that comes from having done this before, from knowing exactly what's coming and exactly what needs to happen before it arrives. When the storm finally breaks, it does so with a suddenness that's genuinely unsettling even after you've experienced it many times before. The wind rises fast, from a low background hum to a full, roaring pressure against the walls within what feels like minutes. And the snow, when it comes, often arrives sideways, driven hard enough that stepping outside even briefly becomes something closer to a serious risk than a simple errand. Inside, the cabin feels smaller on a night like this, the walls seeming to draw closer around the fire, the whole family gathered nearer the hearth than usual, an instinctive clustering that has as much to do with genuine reassurance as it does with actual warmth. You keep the fire built higher than usual on a night like this, feeding it more generously, because the storm outside is actively working to pull heat from the cabin faster than a calm winter night ever would, testing every seam, every gap, every weakness in the structure with a thoroughness that ordinary cold simply doesn't manage. The sound of a real storm against these walls is unlike anything else you experience out here, a deep, continuous roar punctuated by sharper gusts that make the whole structure shudder audibly. Snow hissing hard against the shutters, the chimney occasionally producing a low, unsettling moan as wind forces its way past the flue. You've learned, over the years, not to let this sound frighten you the way it once did, but you'd be lying if you said it doesn't still command your full attention every single time. Sleep on a night like this comes in shorter, lighter stretches than usual, the household never quite settling into the deep, restful sleep of a calmer night. Everyone's awareness staying just slightly closer to the surface, ready to respond if the storm demands something more from you than simple endurance. There's a particular kind of watchfulness required on a night like this that goes beyond the normal rhythm of fire tending we've talked about already tonight. You check the chimney more frequently, alert to any change in the fire's behavior that might suggest the storm is affecting the draft in some concerning way. You listen for any shift in the roof above you, any sound that might suggest snow accumulating faster than the pitched design can safely shed. You keep a closer watch on the youngest children, aware that the storm's noise and the household's own heightened tension can make for a restless, anxious night for anyone too young to fully understand what's happening or why everyone seems just slightly more alert than usual. This is, in every sense, the winter's sternest test, a night that asks everything of the preparation, the discipline, and the quiet knowledge this family has built across so many ordinary evenings, and getting through it safely is never something you take entirely for granted, no matter how many times you've done it before. Eventually, sometime in the deep hours of the night, or perhaps not until well into the following day, the storm begins to ease, the roar softening gradually into something closer to an ordinary winter wind, the snow slowing from its sideways assault into a gentler, more familiar fall. There's a particular exhaustion that settles over the household in the storm's aftermath, a bone-deep tiredness that comes from hours of heightened alertness finally allowed to relax, and it's often not until the wind has fully died that anyone in this cabin truly sleeps deeply again. The morning after brings its own quiet ritual, one different from an ordinary morning's routine, slower, more careful, shaped by the need to properly assess what the night actually cost before returning to the usual rhythm of the day. You step outside first, as always, and the world you find waiting is transformed again, more dramatically this time, drifts piled high against the walls, the trail toward the road buried deeper than you've seen it in weeks. Tree branches bent low under a heavier weight of snow than the storm's noise alone had prepared you for. You walk the full perimeter of the cabin slowly, checking every wall, every seam, every place the wind might have found a new weakness to exploit, and there's real relief, quiet but genuine, in finding the structure exactly as sound as it was the evening before. The walls held, the roof held. Whatever the storm threw against this small wooden shelter, it wasn't enough. And that fact settles into you the way it always does, not as triumph exactly, but as confirmation. One more piece of evidence that the work you've put into this place across so many seasons was work worth doing. The animals get checked next, and this is always the moment carrying the most genuine uncertainty, because livestock caught in a storm this severe don't always come through it unscathed. This time, to your relief, everyone is accounted for, cold and restless and eager for feed, but alive and well, the small reinforced shelter having done exactly what it was built to do. You spend a little longer than usual with them this morning, checking each one more carefully, grateful in a way that doesn't need words, before turning back toward the cabin and the fire that's been kept burning steadily throughout the worst of the night. Inside, the household moves slowly through the morning's tasks, everyone a little quieter than usual, worn down by a night of interrupted sleep and sustained alertness. But there's an unmistakable warmth to the mood as well, the particular closeness that comes from having weathered something difficult together and come out the other side intact. Breakfast takes on a slightly more celebratory quality this morning. Nothing elaborate, simply the same stored food prepared with the same practiced hands, but eaten with the quiet satisfaction of people who understand, without needing to say it aloud, exactly what they've come through. The children, resilient in the particular way children so often are, seem to have already mostly forgotten the anxious edge of the previous night, more interested now in the strange, beautiful landscape of deep new snow waiting just outside the door than in dwelling on what it took to get here safely. As the days that follow settle back into their familiar rhythm, wood gathered, fires tended, animals checked, meals prepared from the careful stores laid up months before, you find yourself thinking, more than usual, about the sheer accumulated weight of everything that's carried this family safely through another hard stretch of winter. It's tempting, looking back, to point to any single decision as the reason things turned out well, the well-sealed walls, the carefully banked fire, the deep woodpile, the watchful nights. But the truth, you've come to understand over so many winters out here, is that no single choice ever carries a family through a season like this one. It's the accumulation of all of it together, every unglamorous task completed on schedule, every small lesson learned the hard way and never forgotten. Every night, someone woke in the deep cold hours to tend a fire that mattered more than they'd ever fully be thanked for. Survival out here was never one dramatic act. It was always this, 1,000 small disciplines, repeated faithfully until repetition itself became the thing standing between a family and the wilderness, pressing in against every wall. There's a particular shift that begins almost imperceptibly somewhere in these final weeks of the coldest stretch, a lengthening of the daylight hours so gradual you barely notice it happening until, one afternoon, you realize the light is still holding at an hour that would have been fully dark only a few weeks earlier. It's not spring yet, not by any real measure. The cold still has weeks, sometimes months of genuine bite left in it. But there's a change in the quality of the light, a promise carried in those extra minutes of afternoon brightness that the long, dark stretch of the year has, at last, begun its slow turn back toward warmth. You've learned not to celebrate too early. Winter out here has a way of delivering its harshest stretches right when hope starts creeping in, but you notice the shift all the same, and you allow yourself, quietly, a small measure of that same hope, because a family that's made it this far has earned at least that much. Looking back over the whole of this long, cold season, what stays with you most isn't any single storm or any single frightening night, though there were certainly nights that tested you thoroughly. What stays with you is the rhythm itself, the fire tended 100 times over, the walls checked and rechecked, the animals fed and secured, the children kept warm and fed and, more than anything, kept together as a family through months that could easily have pulled at the seams of anyone's patience and endurance. You think about the families who came before you out here, the ones whose hard lessons became your own inherited wisdom, and the families who will come after, who'll learn some of what you've learned tonight, from watching you the same way you once watched those who came before. There's a continuity to this life, a passing forward of knowledge earned the hard way, that feels, in its own quiet manner, like its own kind of warmth, separate from the fire, but every bit as real. And so, as this particular winter continues its slow march toward its eventual close, the cabin stands exactly where it's always stood, small and sturdy against a wilderness that has never once made survival easy and never will. Inside, a family sleeps close together beneath heavy quilts, a fire glows steady in its bed of ash, a stone waits by the hearth to be warmed again. Come evening, and somewhere, in the deep hours of whatever night this happens to be, someone will wake, cross the dark room without needing to think about it, and tend that fire one more time, because that is simply what this life asks, and that is simply what gets done. There's something worth sitting with as we come to the end of tonight's story together, something about what all of this, the sealed walls, the banked fires, the layered wool, the shared warmth of bodies close together through the longest nights of the year, actually represents. It isn't really about wood and clay and wool at all, not fundamentally. It's about a family choosing, night after night, season after season, to look after each other with a discipline and a tenderness that never announced itself as anything special, that simply showed up, quietly, in the smallest hours of the coldest nights again and again, until it became the whole shape of a life. The world these families lived in demanded almost everything of them, and they answered that demand not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 small, unremarkable acts of care, and there's something genuinely moving in that, something worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight. You are warm right now, wherever you're listening from, in a way that took no chopping of wood, no sealing of walls, no anxious watch through the coldest hour of the night. That warmth was hard won by people who came long before you, who understood something true about survival that's easy to forget in a world where warmth simply happens at the flip of a switch. So, as you settle in now, blankets pulled close, the day finally behind you, spare a quiet thought for that small cabin in the snow, for the fire someone is tending in your imagination even now, for the family gathered close against a cold that no longer has any power over you at all. Let the sound of that wind against those old timber walls carry you gently toward sleep. You've made it through the whole night with them safe and warm, and now at last you can rest too. Close your eyes. Let the cabin fade into the dark. Sleep well, and we'll meet again soon for another night, another story, another gentle fire burning somewhere far away.